Welcome to the podcast. I hope you enjoy my stories. Today's episode is Evil Wears Red. Copyright 2026, all rights reserved. Now let's get into this haunting horror story. My name is known in this village, the way weather is known. People look up when I pass. They note the red cape, the basket on my arm, the particular way I walk the road to the forest without fear. They say, "There goes the girl." They say, "What a tragedy, what a strong girl, what a good girl." They say many things. I have learned to let them. I was born in this village 17 years ago to parents who should not have had children. This is not a complaint. It is simply true. The way stones are true, the way winter is true. My father was a man who mistook loudness for strength, and my mother was a woman who mistook endurance for virtue. They endured each other for 15 years. They endured me. They endured my sister Marta, who was 3 years older than me and made entirely of different material than the rest of us. Where we were hard, enclosed, Marta was open. Where we were gray, she was something else. I noticed this early. I did not have words for it then. I simply knew that she was the only person in our house I wished to be near. My parents died when I was 12. It was winter, and the roads were ice, and the drop from the Miller's Ridge was considerable. These things happen. The priest said so at the burial, and I stood beside Marta in the cold, and held her hand, and she wept, and I watched the hole in the frozen ground and thought about the particular sound the ice makes when it is walked on. A dry cracking sound. Like something that was never meant to hold weight finally admitting it. No proof was ever offered regarding their deaths. None was asked for. My father was known to drink. The road was known to be dangerous. My mother was known to follow my father wherever he went, even when she should not have. These were the facts the village assembled, and they were satisfied with them. People are easily satisfied when the answer requires nothing of them. Marta wept for weeks. I sat with her through all of it. I brought her water and I stroked her hair, and I told her it would be all right, and I believed none of it, and it did not matter because she needed to hear it, and I needed her to stop weeping, and eventually she did. We went to live with our grandmother after that. The village arranged it the way villages arrange things, with much discussion and little action until finally something is done and everyone feels righteous. Grandmother's cottage sat at the near edge of the great forest, which most people in the village considered too far and slightly ominous, and were therefore grateful someone else was willing to go there. Marta and I walked there on a Tuesday in February, with everything we owned in 2 bags. The trees stood on one side of us the whole way. I looked at them. They looked back. Grandmother was a small woman, made mostly of bone and opinion. She was not unkind. She fed us and she asked little, and she had a way of looking at me sometimes across the supper table that I did not care for, a long, considering look, as though she was reading something written in a language she almost understood. I learned to smile when she looked at me that way. Smiling, I have found, answers most questions before they are asked. Marta did not need to learn this. Marta simply was what she appeared to be. This is a gift I have observed in very few people, and in none of them so completely as in my sister. She had no hidden rooms. She was the same in the dark as in the daylight, and this seemed to cause her no difficulty whatsoever. I found it remarkable. I still do. We lived 3 years, the 3 of us, in that cottage. They were not unhappy years. Marta made them not unhappy, which is what Marta did wherever she was, and I stayed near Marta, which is what I did. It was in the second of those 3 years that Marta met the man who would become her husband. I will speak of him more later. For now, I will say only that he came from the far edge of the valley, and that he was large and dark-haired, and that he looked at my sister the way people look at something they cannot believe is real. I watched him look at her that first time. I decided I did not hate him. This was the most I had ever offered any man, and he did not know it, and it does not matter. They were married in the village church on a Thursday in late autumn. I stood beside my sister as witness. She wore a dress the color of cream, and she was so happy it was almost difficult to look at directly, the way certain kinds of light are difficult. I looked anyway. I wanted to remember it exactly. I have always had a precise memory for the things that matter to me and very little memory for anything else. The red cape had been Marta's. She wore it on cold mornings walking to market, and the red was deep and good against the gray of the winter road. And I told her once it suited her, and she laughed and pulled it off her own shoulders and put it on mine right there in the road, and said, "Then you shall have it," and I said I could not, and she said, "You can and you will," and so I did. This is the only thing I have ever been given that I wanted. I wear it still. Every day. Every walk through the forest to grandmother's cottage, which I began making alone after everything happened, which I will come to in time. The village sees the red cape coming and going, and they find it comforting, I think. A kind of continuity. The girl in the red cape, walking the forest road, brave and steady. They wave and I wave back, and they return to their lives satisfied. I have always understood what people need to see. I have always been willing to show it to them. The forest itself, I will say something about because it matters. It is old. Older than the village, older than the valley, old in a way that has nothing to do with years and everything to do with what has happened under its branches. Things live in it that the village prefers not to name directly. There are paths that are safe and paths that require more care, and one learns, if one walks them enough, which is which. I began walking them at 12, and I know them now the way I know my own hands. I was not afraid of the forest then. I am not afraid of it now. I was not afraid of what lived in it either, though perhaps I should clarify. Fear requires a kind of uncertainty. You must not know what a thing will do. You must wonder. I have never wondered about the forest. I have only ever known what needed to be done in it. There is a difference. That is who I am. That is where I come from. Everything else follows from these facts the way winter follows autumn, the way the crack of ice follows the weight placed upon it. Proceed, then. There is more to tell. His name was Otto. From the far side of the valley, where the land flattens and the farms run long and narrow between the tree lines, that is where he came from. Third son of a family with more children than prospects, which in those days meant you made your own way or you made nothing at all. Good with his hands. Good with animals. A straightforward quality about him that people trusted on sight, the way you trust a well-made tool, not because you know it, but because you can see by the look of it that it will do what it is meant to do. 22 years old when he came to our valley. Marta was 18. 15 was I, and already finished growing into whatever I was going to be. This much I will say for him. Not a foolish man. Some men see a kind woman and think, easy. Wrong, always, and they spend the rest of their lives bewildered by it. Not Otto. Marta he saw clearly, and what he saw made him careful with her, deliberate, the way you are deliberate with something of genuine value. Slowly he courted her. Permission he asked of my grandmother, which was the correct thing to do, and grandmother gave it, which surprised no one because Marta was the kind of person grandmothers wanted to see made happy. Sunday afternoons, mostly he came to the cottage that first year, sometimes a weekday evening, always with his hat in his hands and always leaving before full dark. Quietly I observed him during these visits, from a slight distance, taking careful note, as I observe most things. Most people are false in small ways constantly, the way water finds small cracks, and you learn to see it if you watch long enough. In him, there was none of that. What showed on his face was what lived underneath it. Glad to see my sister, and he showed it plainly. Uncertain sometimes, that too. Occasionally annoyed by small things, a broken fence post, a neighbor's careless remark, but without dwelling and without pretending otherwise. Acceptable, I found him. As I have said, For me, this was considerable. With her whole self, Marta loved him, which was the only way Marta did anything. Over those months, I watched it happen, that particular kind of falling, the way her face changed when she heard his step on the path, the way her laugh became fuller around him, less careful. Easy laughter had always been hers, but this was different. This was a woman who had found the place she intended to remain and had stopped moving toward anything else. Glad for her I was. Precise about this, I want to be, because genuine gladness is rare enough in me to be worth noting. Not performed gladness, not the face I wear for the village on ordinary days, but something actual and quiet that lived behind my ribs when I watched them together. She deserved this. If anyone in the world deserved a thing, it was Marta, and this was the thing she wanted, and so I was glad. I did not tell her so. We did not speak that way. But she knew regardless, because Marta could read me in a way no one else ever has or ever will again. Sometimes she would look at me and simply nod, as though I had spoken aloud when I had said nothing, and yet somehow she had heard it anyway. Not been read since. Do not expect to be again. The following autumn they married. Steady work at the mill on the North Road Auto had by then found, and lodging arranged in the village proper, a small house with a sound roof, and a garden that Marta immediately began to improve. The spring after the wedding we planted it together, side by side in the dirt, and she talked about what she wanted to grow, and I turned the soil and listened, and it was one of the better mornings I can account for in my life. A good husband, in the most fundamental sense of the word. Long hours at the mill, and home tired and grateful for whatever was made and set before him. No drinking beyond reason. No raised hand, no raised voice. What broke he fixed, and without complaint. In that small house Marta was happy, and her happiness was visible from the road, which is the best thing you can say about any life. Then the changes began. Before she did, I noticed. This is not pride. Only that I watch without the interference of love, which causes people to see what they wish rather than what is. Marta wished to see Otto well, and so she saw him well, longer than she should have. Small things first. On certain nights a restlessness in him, a pacing, an inability to sit still in a man who had always been naturally still. Something different in his eyes, not in their color but in their quality, the way the light sat in them, as though something had moved in behind them and taken up residence there. Through his sleep he began to sweat. Before dawn sometimes, he would rise and stand outside in the cold for long stretches, as though the air indoors had become insufficient. The weight fell off him and returned differently, packed hard into his shoulders and through his chest, and those hands which had always been large grew larger still, the nails thickening and darkening at their edges. To the doctor in the village he went. What passed between them I cannot say. What I know is that he came home from that visit and sat at the kitchen table a long time without speaking, and across from him, Marta sat and held those changed hands in hers and asked nothing, which was exactly right, and eventually he told her whatever there was to tell. When he finished, she was quiet a moment. Then she said, "All right." Just that. All right. In the next room I sat. I heard everything and said nothing, and went on with what I was doing. The valley had its stories. All valleys do, and most stories have a thread of truth wound through the middle if you know how to find it. The old records, the talk at the well, the things grandmothers said quietly when they thought children were not listening. What walks in the forest on certain nights. What waits in certain bloodlines, patient and silent, until the right conditions call it forward. These stories had always interested me the way most dark things interest me, with a clean, detached curiosity, the way you study a blade for its qualities without intending to be cut. Now those stories were in my sister's house. Sitting at her kitchen table. Watched and waited, I did. Marta had said all right, and what Marta decided I did not interfere with. Not then. The first full moon came and went without incident. The second also. On the third, deep in a January that had already killed 2 of the miller's sheep and cracked the ice on the well, Otto did not come home before dark as he always had. Marta sat up waiting. Beside her I sat. We did not speak about what we were waiting for. The candle burned down and she lit another, and outside the moon came up full and enormous over the tree line, so bright it laid shadows across the floor through the window glass, sharp and clear as midday, which is not a natural thing and has never seemed so to me no matter how many times I have seen it. Before dawn he came home. Blood on him that he could not explain. His hands shaking. To the basin, Marta took him and washed him without a word, and put him to bed and sat beside him until he slept. From the doorway I watched. Already I knew. Marta too, I believe, in that place where you know things before you are willing to call them by their name. Nothing was said. Winter continued. The valley was quiet. The 4th moon killed her. I will tell it plainly, because there is no other way to tell it that serves her memory honestly. It was March. The snow was still on the ground but thinning, gray and collapsing into itself the way March snow does, as though tired of the effort. The moon came up full on a Tuesday night, and I was at grandmother's cottage as I sometimes stayed, and Marta was alone with Otto in the small house in the village, and by morning she was dead. That is the fact of it. Everything else is detail. The detail is this. What the neighbors heard in the night they described as an animal sound, something between a howl and a human cry, coming from inside the house, and then Marta's voice, once saying his name, and then nothing more. In the morning, it was the baker's wife who raised the alarm, having noticed the door standing open in the cold and no smoke from the chimney, which was not a thing Marta would ever allow on a winter morning. Inside, they found her, on the floor of the main room. What had been done to her, I will not describe in full. I will say only that it was not the work of anything that walks on 2 legs in the ordinary way of men, and that she had not suffered long, and that the red cape she had given me the previous winter was folded on the chair by the door where she had placed it, intending to return it, having borrowed it against the cold the week before, and it was entirely unmarked. I have thought about that often. The cape folded on the chair. Marta, even in whatever those last hours held, had folded it neatly. Otto was found in the barn, curled in the straw in the corner farthest from the door, naked and shaking and covered in blood that was not his own. When they brought him out into the thin March light, he looked at the men around him with an expression I have seen on no other human face before or since. Not guilt, though guilt was there. Something underneath the guilt. A man staring into a depth that had opened inside himself and finding no bottom to it. They did not kill him then, which surprised many. The magistrate was a deliberate man who believed in the forms of justice, even when justice itself was not entirely sure what to do. There were questions asked. There were answers given that satisfied no one. In the end, what saved Otto from the rope that week was the simple fact that what had clearly done what had been done to my sister was not something the law had clear provisions for, and the magistrate was not a man who acted where his authority was unclear. So they deliberated. And while they deliberated, on the 3rd night of his confinement, Otto broke the lock on the door of the room where they were keeping him and walked into the forest and did not come back. The village called this cowardice. They called it guilt confirmed. They called it many things. What they did not call it, at least not openly, was a mercy to themselves, because a trial would have required them to say aloud what they all knew, and none of them wished to name in daylight. I was brought from grandmother's cottage that first morning. A neighbor came for me, the blacksmith's son, young enough to have been given the task because none of the older men wanted it. He told me on the road, and I listened, and when he finished, I said thank you for telling me, and he did not know what to do with that, so he said nothing further, and we walked the rest of the way in silence. In the village, I did what was required of me. I wept at the correct moments. I allowed myself to be held by the women who came to hold me. I answered questions in a small voice and accepted food. I did not eat and sat through the long hours of that first day in the way that was expected. And I did all of it correctly because I had been doing such things correctly my entire life in grief. Even real grief, even the only real grief I have ever known, does not switch off the part of me that watches and calculates and performs. But beneath all of it, the grief was real. I want to be clear on this point. Marta was dead, and the thing that lived in my chest, where she had been, was not nothing. It was an absence with weight and edges, a specific shape, the exact shape of her. I felt it that first day, and I felt it walking home, and I felt it in the weeks and months that followed, and I feel it still, on certain mornings, when the light comes through a window at a particular angle, and for just a moment the world looks the way it looked when she was in it. I am not without feeling. I have one feeling. I had it for her, and for no one else, and I have it for no one else now. The rest is simply management. They buried her on a Friday. The ground was still hard, and the gravediggers had worked since before dawn to get it ready in time. The priest said the words. The village stood in the thin cold and bowed their heads, and I stood among them in the red cape that had been hers, and I did not bow my head. I looked at the box they were putting into the ground, and I made her a promise. Not an elaborate promise. Not a speech. Simply a fact stated quietly inside myself, the way you note a thing that needs doing and set it aside until you are able to do it. He would die for this. Not the law. Not the rope. Not exile into the forest where he would live out his days and suffer and eventually be forgotten. Those were not sufficient. Those did not balance what I was owed. He would die, and I would be the instrument of it, and I would choose the moment and the manner, and it would be done correctly, which meant it would be done in a way that cost me nothing. This was not vengeance as stories tell it, hot and immediate and ruinous to the avenger. This was a long and patient arithmetic. Marta was on one side of the equation. His death was on the other. Everything else was simply the working out of the problem. I was 16 years old, standing at my sister's grave, making this calculation. In the weeks that followed, I moved back to grandmother's cottage, which was the practical thing. The small house in the village, where Marta had been happy, I did not go back to. There was no reason to go back. What had been there was gone. Grandmother asked me nothing, and I told her nothing, and we lived together in the way we had lived before, which suited me. The village continued to regard me with the particular tenderness reserved for the twice bereaved. The girl who had lost her parents and now her sister. The girl who kept walking through the dark forest alone, brave and quiet in her red cape. They wanted to take care of me, and I let them want this because it cost me nothing and kept them satisfied. Out in the forest, beyond the tree line, in the deep places where the paths ran out and the old dark settled between the trunks like something with weight and intention, Otto lived. I knew this. The village suspected it, but did not say so. Occasionally, something was found at the forest edge, a print too large for a man's bare foot, a sheep taken cleanly in the night. People made the signs their grandmothers had taught them and fastened their shutters and did not speak of it directly. I spoke of it to no one. But on my walks through the forest, on the road to grandmother's cottage with my basket on my arm, sometimes I felt him out there in the trees. Watching. The guilt of him, like a pressure, against the side of my face. Once in the second year, I saw him at a distance between the pines, the shape of him, larger than he had been, darker, standing utterly still. I looked directly at him. I did not stop walking. Let him watch. Let him carry the guilt of her out there in the cold and the dark. Let him believe that I had forgiven him or forgotten or simply continued, because that is what my face told him when I looked at him between the pines without breaking stride. Time is not a difficulty for me. I have always understood that the right moment is the one you have prepared for, not the one that arrives on its own. Marta had been a patient woman. I could be patient too. For her, I could be anything at all. 3 years passed. This is how time moves when you're waiting. Not slowly, not quickly, but with a kind of indifferent steadiness, the way a river moves, neither caring about what it carries nor what it leaves on the bank. 3 years and the village forgot to grieve, and remembered only to pity, which suited me better anyway. Pity asks less of a person than grief does. Pity only requires that you look somewhat diminished, somewhat fragile, somewhat in need, and these are easy things to perform when you have been performing them your whole life. Grandmother's cottage became my cottage in all but name. The old woman moved through her days, and I moved through mine alongside her, and we did not trouble each other unduly. She was not a cruel woman. She fed the birds in winter and kept a clean house, and said her prayers each night with a sincerity I found neither admirable nor contemptible, simply noted. On Sundays, the village women came to drink tea and talk, and I sat among them and listened, and said the small correct things at the correct intervals, and they went home feeling that the girl was coming along. The girl was managing. What a strong girl. What a quiet, steady girl. The walks through the forest I made twice weekly. This was established early and maintained without variation, because routine is the best concealment there is. A girl who walks the same road at the same time, with the same basket, becomes invisible in the way that familiar things become invisible. No one watches the clock on the wall. No one marks the cat crossing the yard. I was the girl with the red cape on the forest road, and after 3 years I was as unremarkable and as trusted as either of those things. The forest I knew, by then the way you know a thing you have studied with genuine attention. Every bend in the path, every place where the trees thinned and the light came through, and every place where they closed overhead and the light did not come at all. The places where the ground was soft and held a print, and the places where it was root and stone and held nothing. I knew which birds called in which part of the wood and what their calling meant, and I knew the silences too, which are more informative than the sounds if you have learned to read them. And I knew where Otto went. Not precisely. The deep forest does not offer precision, but the shape of his territory, the boundaries of it, the places he favored, these things revealed themselves over time to anyone paying the right kind of attention. A broken branch at a consistent height. A smell on certain mornings, animal and dark, that did not belong to anything the forest naturally produced. Prints occasionally, where the ground was soft enough, and the prints were of a man and then of something that was not quite a man and then of something that was not a man at all in the same trail, the way a sentence changes its meaning as you read further into it. He watched me on the road. I had known this since the 2nd year, but by the 3rd year it had become as familiar as anything else. A presence at the tree line, just beyond the point where the eye could resolve shadow into shape. Sometimes closer. Once near enough that I could hear, just barely, the particular quality of breathing that is too large for an ordinary man. I walked the road, and he watched from the trees, and neither of us acknowledged the other, and this was its own kind of conversation. Grandmother knew he was out there. This I understood without being told. On certain mornings, she left things at the forest edge, a heel of bread, a piece of salted meat wrapped in cloth, small provisions placed on the flat stone near the first trees as though by accident, as though she had simply set something down and forgotten it. By afternoon, the stone was always bare. She never spoke of this, and I never asked, and between us the knowledge sat unacknowledged, which is where I preferred it. That she pitied him, I understood. That she believed his suffering sufficient payment for what he had done, I also understood, though I did not share the belief. Grandmother's theology was one of mercy. She had built her life on the idea that suffering redeems and that forgiveness is the highest human function, and that even the worst things can be absorbed and gentled by enough of both. She was wrong, of course, but she was old, and it had served her well enough, and I did not argue with it. I noted it instead, filed it in the place where I keep things that will be useful later. The village had by this time constructed a complete and satisfying story about Otto in the forest. He was the monster, the beast, The thing that had killed the miller's sheep and the blacksmith's dog, and possibly, though no one said this directly, 2 travelers who had gone into the forest on the north road and not come out the other side. Children were told not to go near the trees after dark. Mothers told it to them with real fear, which is the most convincing kind of telling, and the children believed it and grew up believing it, and the story hardened into fact the way stories do when everyone agrees to them long enough. This was useful to me. I had not arranged it, but I recognized its value, and I tended it when the opportunity arose. A word here, a shudder there, a quiet account of something glimpsed on the forest road, delivered in a small voice to the right woman at the right moment, knowing she would carry it to 6 others before sundown. I did not lie precisely. I described shadows and sounds, and the feeling of being watched, and all of these things were true. I simply allowed the listeners to assemble them into the shape they were already inclined to see. The lumberjack I will mention here because he enters the story here, or rather I mark him here, though he did not know he had been marked. His name was Brennan. A large man, broad through the chest, who worked the forest on the south side cutting timber for the mill. Not unintelligent, but loud in the particular way of men who have never had reason to be otherwise, men to whom the world has generally presented itself as willing and accommodating, and who have therefore never developed the habit of quietness. He was not a bad man. This I will concede. He was simply a man who took up more space than was his, in the way that some people do, not from malice, but from a simple failure to notice that space belongs to more than themselves. At the harvest dance in the 3rd autumn after Marta died, he asked me to dance. He did it clumsily, approached from the wrong angle, said the wrong preliminary things, laughed too loudly at something that was not funny. When I declined, he apologized in a way that managed to suggest the fault was somehow mutual, which it was not, and then he laughed again and moved on to someone else and forgot about it entirely within the hour. I watched him forget about it. I watched him dance with the blacksmith's daughter and drink too much of the harvest ale and clap other men on the shoulder, and fill the room with his noise and his bigness and his easy, uncomplicated life. I did not forget about it. This is perhaps the thing about me that would most disturb people if they understood it, more than anything else, more even than what happened to my parents or what I was building toward for Otto. The lumberjack was a minor irritation. A small rudeness, barely that, the kind of thing that happens at every dance in every village and is forgotten by morning. By any reasonable measure, it was nothing. But I do not have a reasonable measure for such things. I have only the list, and once a name is on the list, it does not come off. Brennan the lumberjack, broad and loud and unaware, who asked me to dance badly and apologized worse, and then forgot me entirely. I did not forget him. These things require patience. They require a clear understanding of what you want and what you are willing to spend to get it, and they require the ability to hold a plan in your mind for as long as necessary without it curdling into something hasty and wasteful. Hasty is how people are caught. Hasty is how the careful work of years gets undone in an impulsive moment. I am not hasty. I have never been hasty. By the end of that 3rd year, the shape of what needed to happen had become clear to me. Not all at once, but the way a landscape becomes clear as morning comes. First the outline, and then the detail, and then finally the whole of it, obvious, as though it had always been there, and you had simply been waiting for enough light to see it properly. Otto would die. This had always been true. Grandmother would have to go first. This I had come to understand slowly, and then all at once, the way you understand things that require something of you. She was not part of what I wanted. She was not an enemy. But she was a door that needed to be opened, and you cannot open a door without moving what is on the other side of it. And Brennan the lumberjack, loud and large and innocent of everything except that one small forgettable rudeness at a harvest dance, would be standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, which is to say exactly the place and time I intended for him. The plan was complete. Winter came. I walked the forest road with my basket, and the red cape bright against the gray, and the village watched me pass and thought, what a good girl. What a steady girl. What a tragedy, and yet how well she bears it. I walked and I thought about spring. Spring would do nicely. Spring came the way it always comes to that valley, reluctantly and then all at once. The snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, and the mud arriving in its place. Deep and honest mud that sucked at your boots and smelled of everything that had been frozen and was now releasing itself back into the world. The birds returned. The days lengthened. In the village, people opened their shutters and turned their faces up to the thin new sun with the particular gratitude of people who have survived another winter and are not yet sure they deserved to. I watched all of this and made my preparations. Grandmother first. This required thought, not because I was uncertain, but because the manner of it mattered enormously. The manner was in fact the whole of it. What I needed was a scene, and a scene requires arrangement the way a stage requires arrangement. Every element in its place before the players arrive. Nothing left to chance. Nothing that cannot be explained by the explanation you have already prepared. She was old. This was the foundation on which everything else would be built. 71 years old, small and boned like a bird, with a heart that the doctor in the village had been watching with professional concern for the better part of 2 years. He had said things to her about rest and about cold, and about the unwisdom of living alone at the forest edge at her age, and she had listened to him with the polite attention she gave to all advice she had no intention of taking. I had been present for one such conversation. I had added my voice to his, gently, expressing my own worry, and grandmother had patted my hand and said she was perfectly fine, and the doctor had looked at me with a sympathy that was really a kind of apology for his own helplessness. An old woman with a compromised heart, living alone at the edge of a dark forest. These were the facts available to anyone who wished to assemble them. I considered several possibilities and discarded them one by one the way you discard tools that are adequate but not quite right for the particular work. What I arrived at was simple, which is always best. Simple things hold together. Simple things do not develop unexpected complications at the wrong moment. Simple is what looks, afterward, like the obvious and inevitable explanation. A pillow is a simple thing. On a Wednesday morning in late April, I rose before grandmother did, which required only that I sleep lightly, which I have always done. Made the fire. Put the kettle on. Let the ordinary sounds of the morning establish themselves, so that they were already part of the air in the cottage by the time anything else occurred. Then I went to her room. She was sleeping still on her back, which was how she always slept, with her hands folded on her chest in the manner of someone who had been practicing for a long time at looking peaceful. Her breathing was the slow, shallow breathing of the very old, each breath a small negotiation, nothing taken for granted. I stood in the doorway a moment and looked at her. Not unkindly. I want to be precise about this. There was nothing unkind in what I felt standing there. She had taken us in when we had nowhere to go. She had fed us and asked little, and she had loved Marta, genuinely, in her limited elderly way. And Marta had loved her back, and for that alone I owed her something, some measure of acknowledgement. She was not a bad woman. She was simply in the way of a necessary thing. It did not take long. She did not wake. The heart that had been failing by degrees simply stopped, which is what failing hearts do when given the correct encouragement, and what the doctor would confirm when he came was entirely consistent with what he had been expecting and dreading. A woman of her age and her condition found in her bed on a spring morning, gone quietly in her sleep, which is what everyone says they want and very few people get. I was fortunate, the village would say, to have been there, to have found her quickly, to have been spared the worst discovery of coming to visit and finding her days gone. Yes, I agreed. I was fortunate. Afterward, I sat in the kitchen and drank tea and looked at the wall and thought about what came next. There was no agitation in me. No trembling of the hands, no racing of the pulse. This is something I have noticed about myself in such moments. The way everything becomes very still and very clear. The way the world simplifies itself down to the next necessary action, and the one after that, clean and sequential, like a list being worked through. The cottage needed to be right. This was the next necessary action. I went through it methodically. Grandmother's room first, smoothing and arranging, making it look precisely like what it was, an old woman's room, an old woman's bed, everything in its ordinary place. The kitchen, already in order. The main room, the hearth, the table, the 2 chairs, the shelf with her small collection of objects accumulated over a long life. A chipped blue bowl, a wooden cross, a child's shoe she had kept for reasons she had never explained. These things I left exactly as they were because they were exactly right. The door I left unlatched. This was the crux of it. The unlocked door was the hinge on which everything else would swing. Because the village knew, without speaking of it openly, that grandmother sometimes left the door unlatched on certain nights. For Otto, for the creature her mercy could not stop feeding even after what it had done, even after Marta, because grandmother's mercy was not conditional, and this was both her greatest quality and the thing that had made her useful to me. The village knew. Not officially, not spoken of directly, but known the way things are known in small places where everyone watches everyone else without admitting to the watching. They knew she left food on the stone at the forest edge. They suspected she left the door unlatched. They had chosen, in the way of people whose mercy has limits that their theology does not permit them to acknowledge, to look away from both. Tonight was a full moon. Otto would come. Of this, I was as certain as I was certain of anything. He came when the moon was full because the full moon was when the guilt was worst, when the beast was strongest, and the man underneath it most desperate for something that still recognized him as having once been human. Grandmother had been that something. The unlatched door and the food on the table and the old woman who did not flinch when she looked at him, these were what he came for. He would come tonight and find the door unlatched as always, and he would come inside and find grandmother dead, and he would find me. But that was tonight, and tonight was hours away yet, and there was nothing more to be done here and nothing more to be gained by staying. I picked up my basket from the table. I looked around the cottage, one last time the way you look at work you have done carefully, checking for the thing you might have missed, the detail that is not quite right, the element that does not belong to the story you have built. There was nothing. It was exactly right. It was exactly what it needed to be. I went to the door and I paused there a moment with my hand on the frame, not from sentiment, not from any feeling about what lay in the back room or what would happen in this cottage before morning, but only to be certain, to give myself one final moment of checking before the thing was fully committed to and beyond adjustment. Everything was in order. I left the door unlatched behind me, and I walked out into the late afternoon light and across the clearing and into the trees, and I did not look back. The forest closed around me the way it always does, quietly and completely, and the cottage disappeared behind me and ahead of me. The path ran toward the village through the long shadows of the afternoon and somewhere far off to the left, in the deep places where the paths ran out, something was already stirring that would not be still much longer. The full moon would be up in a few hours. I went to the village and I bought thread at the dry goods store, and I spoke to the blacksmith's wife about nothing of consequence, and I ate supper at the inn where 3 men from the mills saw me and I nodded back. People would remember this. People always remember a girl who is where she is supposed to be, going about her ordinary business, unremarkable and calm. That is the point of ordinary business. That is why you do it. The path back through the forest was a different thing at night than it was in the day. Not frightening. I want to be clear about that. The forest at night has never frightened me, and it did not frighten me that night. Not the dark between the trees, nor the sounds that live in that dark, nor the particular quality of silence that falls over the wood when something large is moving through it somewhere, and everything else has gone still to listen. I had walked this path in every kind of dark there is, and I knew it the way I knew my own hands, and there was nothing in it that could surprise me. But it was different. The same roots, the same stones, the same places where the ground went soft near the stream crossing. All of it the same, and all of it altered by the absence of light, the way a familiar face is altered by sleep, recognizable but changed, showing you something it does not show in the ordinary way of things. In the daylight, the forest is a place you move through. At night it becomes a place that moves around you, that rearranges itself just at the edge of your perception, not maliciously, not with any intention at all, but simply because darkness is the forest's natural condition and the daytime version of it, the bright patched canopied version that people walk through with their baskets and their dogs and their easy chatter, is the performance, and this, the night version, the version that has been here since before the village was a thought in anyone's mind. This is the truth of it. I had always preferred the truth of things. I carried no lantern. There was no need, and besides, I did not want one. What I wanted was to move through the dark, the way the dark moves through itself, quietly and without announcing anything, without the small bubble of yellow light that a lantern creates around a person, that cone of visibility that shows you 3 feet in every direction and blinds you completely to everything beyond it. People with lanterns think they are safer than people without them. They are wrong. The lantern shows you to everything that is watching long before it shows you anything worth seeing. The basket was on my arm. The same basket I had carried that morning, the cloth still folded inside, the provisions still untouched, the bread and the salt butter and the jar of preserved plums and the paper of tea that grandmother would never now drink. I had not thought to remove them when I went to the village, and now I was glad I had not. The basket was part of the picture, and the picture needed to be complete when the time came for people to look at it, and people would look at it, carefully, the way people look at everything that surrounds a death, searching for the detail that does not fit, and I intended that there should be no such detail. The basket, with its untouched provisions, was not an oversight. It was a girl who had come to visit her grandmother and found something terrible and had been too shocked, too grief-stricken, to think about bread and butter. That is what the basket said. That is what I needed it to say. I thought about Marta. This was not unusual. On the forest path especially I thought about her, because it had been her path too, in the years when we walked it together, and the memory of her was thick here among the trees in a way it was not in the village or in the cottage, a way that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with the simple fact that she had walked here beside me, and her absence from beside me was therefore most precisely felt here, most exactly shaped, the way an empty space takes the shape of what has been removed from it. The path remembered her the way I remembered her, in the specific and the physical, in the particular way her boots had sounded on the root-crossed ground, and the particular way she had held a lantern when she carried one, out to the side and slightly forward, as though lighting the way for someone walking ahead of her rather than for herself. She had always been like that, always lighting the way for someone else. I thought about the garden. The spring after the wedding, the 2 of us in the dirt with our sleeves rolled and the smell of turned earth around us, and her voice naming the things she wanted to grow, not asking my opinion on any of it, not because she did not want it, but because she already knew what she wanted, and naming it aloud was its own kind of pleasure for her, the pleasure of a person who has decided something good and wants to hear the sound of it in the air. Carrots and leeks and the particular variety of bean their mother had grown, and that Marta had somehow obtained the seeds for, tracking them down with the quiet persistence she brought to everything she cared about. Herbs along the south wall, where the light was best. Sweet peas along the fence because they were beautiful, and beauty, Marta had always maintained, was as necessary as anything else and should be planned for accordingly. I had not argued with this. I had turned the soil and listened, and it had been one of the better mornings I can account for. I thought about the way she laughed. Not the public version of it, the warm, easy laugh she gave to neighbors and acquaintances, and the various people who attached themselves to her, the way people always attached themselves to warmth. but the private version, the one that was unguarded and a little helpless, that came out of her when something caught her genuinely off guard, and she had no time to moderate it. The one that was too loud and went on slightly too long, and that she always covered afterward with her hand, and a look of mock apology that fooled no one. I had heard that laugh perhaps a dozen times in her life, and I remembered each instance with a precision I do not bring to most things, the exact circumstance, the exact sound of it, the exact way her face looked in the moment before her hand came up. I thought about the red cape, the moment in the road when she had pulled it from her own shoulders without hesitation and settled it on mine, as though she had been carrying it all along with the specific intention of giving it to me and had only been waiting for the right moment to arrive. I had said I could not take it, and she had said you can and you will, and that had been the end of the discussion, because when Marta decided something, there was a pleasantness to her certainty that made argument feel not wrong exactly, but beside the point, like arguing with the direction of a river. The cape was around my shoulders now in the night air, warm and dark red, and the only thing of hers I had, the only piece of her that remained in the physical world, and I was aware of it the way I am always aware of it, the weight of it across my shoulders, the particular way the clasp sat at my throat, the way it moved when I walked. I crossed the stream on the flat stones without slipping and continued on into the older part of the wood where the beeches grew, their trunks smooth and pale, and catching what little light there was and holding it in a way that made them seem almost luminous, as though they generated their own cold light from somewhere deep inside the wood of them, the light of things that have stood long enough in the dark to have arrived at some understanding with it that younger things have not yet reached. The wind moved once through the upper branches and then stopped. Everything was very still. I had walked this path in grief and in patience, and in the long, flat days of waiting that had filled the 3 years between Marta's death and this night, and I had walked it in calculation, turning the plan over and over the way you turn a stone to examine all its faces, checking for the flaw, the weakness, the place where it might fail you when you needed it most. I had found no such place. The plan was sound. The plan had always been sound because I had built it carefully and tested it thoroughly in my mind before I committed a single action to it, and what I had committed had been committed cleanly and without error. Grandmother was dead. The scene was set. The village had seen me in the afternoon, at the dry goods store and the inn, ordinary and unremarkable, a girl going about her business. 3 men from the mill could place me there. The blacksmith's wife could place me there. I had bought thread I did not need and eaten food I did not taste and smiled at people who smiled back, and none of them had seen anything in my face except what I had put there for them to see, which was nothing of consequence, which was exactly right. And now I was walking back through the dark forest to the cottage with my basket on my arm and my sister's cape on my shoulders, and 3 years of patient arithmetic arriving at its conclusion. And I felt about this the way I feel about most things when they are correctly done, which is a clean and quiet satisfaction, the satisfaction of the craftsman who has measured twice and cut once and found the fit exact. I did not look to the left where the paths ran out and the deep forest began. There was no need. I knew what was there, and what was there knew I was on the path, and that was sufficient for both of us. Let him know. Let him feel me moving through the trees toward the cottage. Let him feel whatever he felt about that, the guilt of it, the grief of it, the complicated weight of what he was, and what he had done pressing down on him in the dark. He had carried that weight for 3 years. He would not carry it much longer. The clearing opened ahead of me through the last of the trees, and I stepped out of the wood and into the moonlight. It had risen while I was walking, coming up full and enormous over the eastern tree line the way it does in that valley in late April, and the clearing was bright with it, brighter than I had expected, the cottage walls white in it and the garden along the south wall casting sharp, clean shadows, and the door standing just barely open, exactly as I had left it, a thin line of darkness in the white face of the cottage that from a distance looked like nothing, like a door not quite latched. Like the small domestic carelessness of an old woman who did not always remember to close things properly. It did not look like an invitation. That was important. It needed to not look like an invitation, even though that was precisely what it was. I stood at the edge of the clearing for a moment and looked at the cottage and the clearing and the way the moonlight lay over everything, and I found it satisfactory. I found it exactly right. Then I walked across the clearing and up the path to the door and pushed it open and went inside. The cottage was cold. I had let the fire go out before I left that morning and had not remade it, and the cold had settled into the room thoroughly in the hours since. The deep settled cold of a space from which all warmth has been absent long enough that the cold has stopped being the absence of something and has become a presence in its own right, filling the chairs and lying along the floor and sitting in the corners with the patience of something that knows it will eventually be asked to leave and is in no hurry about it. I made the fire. This was ordinary, and it needed to be ordinary. The sounds of it familiar and domestic and entirely consistent with a girl who had come home in the evening and was making herself comfortable. The scrape of the flint, the small, careful coaxing of the first flame, the gradual giving of the wood as the fire found its confidence and began to mean it. These were the right sounds for this hour in this cottage, and I made them deliberately and without haste, and when the fire had caught properly and the room had begun to shift from cold to merely cool, I set the basket on the table and took my usual chair and arranged the red cape around my shoulders and folded my hands in my lap. The cottage settled around me. The fire talked softly to itself, the way fires do. Outside the clearing lay silver and still in the full moonlight, and the forest stood dark at its edge, patient and enormous and indifferent, keeping what it kept the way it always had, without explanation and without apology, the way old things keep their secrets, not from malice, but simply because they have been keeping them so long that keeping has become their nature. I thought about Marta one more time. Not the garden or the laugh or the cape or any of the specific and particular things I have described. Just her face. The way it had looked on that morning in the garden, turned up to the thin spring sun with her eyes closed, receiving the warmth of it without suspicion, without the need to examine it or understand it or determine whether it was the kind of warmth that could be trusted, simply feeling it, simply being glad of it, the way she was glad of all good things, openly and without reservation, as though gladness were a thing that cost nothing and should therefore never be rationed. I held her face in my mind for a long time, there in the chair by the fire in the cottage that had been hers too once, in the red cape that had been hers, in the night that was going to settle what needed settling before morning came. Then I put it away in the room where I keep her, and I closed the door of that room, and I listened to the forest, and I waited. He came the way I knew he would come, in the deep part of the night when the moon was at its highest, and the world outside the cottage windows was as bright and as cold as the inside of a church in winter. I smelled him before I heard him. This will sound strange to anyone who has not spent 3 years walking a forest path with something like Otto living in it, but the change has a smell, a dark mineral smell, something between wet earth and iron, and the wind was coming off the forest toward the cottage that night, and it brought the smell of him ahead of him the way a river brings the news of the mountains. It has come down from long before you reach the mountains themselves. I had smelled it before on the forest path, in the years of walking and waiting, and I knew it the way I knew everything about him, precisely and without sentiment. Then the sound. Not heavy, not crashing, not the way the village imagined such things when they told their stories about what lived in the forest. Quiet, rather. The careful quiet of something large that has learned the hard way that the world is not a safe place for things like it, and has adjusted its movements accordingly. Across the clearing the steps came, barely pressing the silence, and then the soft complaint of the bottom step under real weight, and then nothing. A pause. Long enough to breathe through several times. He was reading the air the way his kind reads it, with everything he had, taking the full account of what was inside, and what was different from every other time he had stood at this door. Much was different. He would know that immediately. He would know it before he touched the door. The door opened. I looked up from the fire. What came through, it had been a man, and was not quite a man now, and would not be fully either thing until one of those states became permanent, which I intended to ensure happened before morning. It filled the doorframe completely, the shoulders touching both sides, the head ducked to clear the lintel, and there was enough of Otto left in the shape of it to be recognizable, and enough of something else to make that recognition a deeply uncomfortable thing, like seeing a beloved place after something terrible has happened to it. The geography still familiar, and the familiarity making everything worse rather than better. The hands were wrong. The jaw was wrong. The breathing was wrong, each breath too large and too deliberate, the breathing of a creature that has more body than it is accustomed to managing and has not yet made its peace with the fact. But the eyes were his. Still unexactly his. Dark and deep-set and carrying everything he had carried for 3 years in the cold and the dark, the guilt of her, the grief of her, the unbearable weight of what he was and what he had done with what he was, and none of it diminished, none of it softened by time or weather or the mercy of forgetting, because some things do not permit themselves to be forgotten, and the look in Otto's eyes told me that this was one of them. Those eyes moved through the room. The empty chair, where grandmother always sat on these nights. The closed door of the back room, behind which she lay arranged exactly as I had arranged her, peaceful and explainable and entirely consistent with the story I had built around her. The basket on the table. The fire. And then me, in the chair, in the red cape, with my hands folded in my lap, and my face giving him nothing he had not already worked out for himself. He knew. I could see that he knew, not just suspected or feared, but knew with the complete and terrible certainty of a man who has understood something he cannot undo, and cannot deny, and cannot explain to anyone who would be willing to listen to him. He knew what had happened in this cottage, and he knew who had done it, and he knew why. And the knowing of the why was perhaps the worst of it, because the why was entirely correct and entirely his fault, and there was nothing in the world left for him to say about any of it. Good. Let him stand in that knowledge. Let him feel the full weight of it pressing down on him in the fire-lit room with the smell of grandmother's herbs still in the air, and her empty chair by the hearth, and the girl in the red cape, watching him from across the room with her hands folded and her face still. A sound came out of him then, low and torn from somewhere that was neither fully the man nor fully the beast, but some raw place that existed between them, where all the things that could not be expressed in either register went to live. It was not a word. It held in it 3 years of cold and guilt and grief, and the specific anguish of a creature that is condemned to remember everything it has done and cannot stop doing. And I had heard nothing like it before, and have heard nothing like it since, and I will say only that it was not a sound I had expected, and that it did something in the room that the room did not recover from, changed the quality of the air in it the way a stone changes the quality of water. And that I noted this, and set it aside, and kept my face still, and my hands folded and waited for it to finish. When it had finished, I stood from the chair. Slowly, no sudden movement, the way you move around something dangerous that you respect enough not to provoke unnecessarily, not from fear, but from the same practical caution that makes you careful with a sharp tool, not because you are afraid of it, but because you understand what it is capable of, and you are not interested in finding out through carelessness. I straightened the red cape on my shoulders. I looked at him across the room, and when I spoke I kept my voice quiet, and even, below the register of the fire, almost gentle, the way you speak to something you do not wish to alarm before you are ready. I told him it was for Marta. 3 words. No speech, no accounting, no inventory of grievances or catalogue of what he had taken from me when he had taken her. 3 years he had lived with the fact of her death, and so had I, and there was nothing remaining that either of us needed to have explained by the other. He knew what he had done. I knew what I was doing. Between people who both know the truth of a thing, there is very little that words can usefully add, and I have never been a person who speaks beyond what is useful. I told him it was for Marta, and I watched his eyes, and what moved through them in the moment after I said it I will not try to describe, because I do not have the right words for it, and I do not believe the right words exist. I will say only that it was not nothing. I will say only that whatever remained of the man who had once looked at my sister as though he could not believe she was real was present in those eyes in that moment, fully present, and that he understood, and that the understanding did not help him and was not meant to. Then he came for me. Fast, faster than you would expect from something that size in a space that's small, the table going over and the basket with it, and the bread and the salt butter, and the jar of preserved plums hitting the floor and the fire flaring in the sudden movement of air, and the whole small cottage shrinking to nothing in the half-second it took him to cross it. And I was already moving, not away, not back, but to the side and down, one sharp movement of my foot as I went. The movement I had been holding in my body for 3 days, patient and ready, the way you hold a breath you are not yet ready to release. The chain was under the table. Heavy iron, cold and good, one end fixed to the iron ring set in the floor that grandmother had used for hanging game in the years when she still kept game, the other end arranged with care across the floor in the path between the door and the chair, slack enough to be invisible in the firelight, and taut enough to do what I needed it to do when the moment came. The moment came. It took him at the ankle, and the floor of that small cottage shook when he hit it, and the sound of it was enormous. A sound that went out through the walls and across the moonlit clearing and into the trees and along the paths in every direction, carrying exactly as far as I needed it to carry, which was far enough to reach the ears of a large, loud man working late on the south side of the forest who would hear it and think, "That is not a sound that should be happening, and I should go and see about it." But he was not finished. I had never imagined, for a moment, that he would be finished by falling. A thing like Otto does not finish by falling. He came up from the floor faster than the fall had taken him down, and the chain held his ankle and slowed him, and that was all it was ever meant to do, buy me the half-second I needed. And I had used the half-second well because I had known exactly what I would do with it, and had rehearsed it in my mind until the rehearsal was indistinguishable from the act itself. What I had placed behind the loose stone in the hearth 3 days prior, when I had first committed to Wednesday, I reached for now without looking, by feel alone, the way you reach for something in the dark that you have placed with sufficient care that the dark makes no difference. What followed, I will not recount in its particulars. It was not quick, and it was not clean, and it bore no resemblance to the way stories tell such things, the clever girl and the defeated monster, and the tidy and inevitable conclusion. It was hard, and it was close, and it was loud, and there were moments in it that required more of me than I had anticipated being required, and there were moments in which the outcome was less certain than I would have preferred, and the details of those moments belong to no one but me, and I intend to keep them that way. What I will say is this. I had prepared more than the chain and the thing behind the stone. I had prepared for the possibility that those would not be sufficient on their own, and I had prepared accordingly, carefully, with the same thoroughness I brought to every element of what I had built. And preparation is a form of strength that has nothing to do with size or speed, and everything to do with having thought further ahead than the thing you are preparing against. He died as the moon began its descent toward the western tree line. I knew it not from any sound he made, but from the silence that replaced the sounds he had been making, a silence of an entirely different quality than any silence that precedes it, complete in the way that only dead things are complete, without the small involuntary sounds, and the heat, and the breathing that living things produce even when they are trying to be still, even when they are very close to the end of being living things at all. That silence arrived, and I knew it for what it was, and I stayed very still inside it for a long moment, letting it be certain, letting it be complete. Then the change. I had known it might happen. The valley's oldest stories said it would, that the beast at death returns to the man it came from, that whatever the moon pulls out of a person goes back in again when the heart stops. And I had allowed for this possibility in my planning without depending on it. Because depending on stories is a kind of foolishness, I do not permit myself regardless of how old the stories are or how many people have believed them for how long. But the stories were right. It was slow. The way ice melts, the way night becomes morning, without any single moment you could hold up and say with certainty, "There, that is where it happened, that is the precise instant of change." But undeniable in its conclusion, undeniable when it was done. What lay on the floor of grandmother's cottage in the wreckage of the overturned table and the scattered provisions and the disordered hearthrug was a man. Large and dark-haired and still. Hands that had once been good at building things and fixing things and holding my sister's hands across a kitchen table. A face that had once looked at her as though it could not believe something so good had chosen him. Otto. Just Otto. A dead man on the floor of a cottage in the forest, large and still and entirely human and entirely dead. I stood over him for a long time. This I had not prepared for adequately. I had prepared for the fight, and I had prepared for the change, and I had prepared for everything that would need to happen after. The arranging and the screaming and the arrival of Brennan the lumberjack, and the performance that would follow, all of it prepared for, all of it thought through to its conclusion. But I had not prepared sufficiently for this moment, for the standing over him after, for the particular quality of looking at a dead man who had once been the husband of the only person I had ever loved and finding in his dead face the ghost of the way he had looked at her. Marta had loved him. This was simply true, and I had always known it was true, and knowing it had never previously required anything of me beyond acknowledgement. But standing over him now in the wrecked cottage with the fire burning low and the moon going down outside the window, it required something more than acknowledgement, and I stood with that requirement for the length of time it takes a candle to burn down an inch, and I did not look away from his face, and I let it require what it required. Then it was done. Then I put it away in the place where I put things that have been felt sufficiently and do not need to be felt further, the room next to the room where I keep Marta, and I closed that door also. The cottage was in considerable disorder. There was work to do, and not much night remaining in which to do it, and Brennan, the lumberjack, was somewhere on the south path, moving toward the cottage with his axe still in his hand, drawn by the sound of the chain, and the fall and everything that had followed, large and loud and innocent, and entirely unaware of what he was walking into. I looked around the cottage, and I began to think about what needed to go where. I worked quickly and without agitation, moving through the tasks the way I move through all necessary things, with full attention and without sentiment, and the work was not complicated because I had thought it through already, and thinking things through in advance is what makes the doing of them simple. The chain back to its place, beneath the loose stone in the hearth. The table righted. The basket retrieved and set where it had been. The hearthrug straightened as much as it could be straightened, which was not entirely, which was correct, because some disorder was part of the story, the disorder of a struggle, of a girl fighting for her life against something that had come through the unlatched door and found her there and done what such things do. Otto I left where he lay. He was the center of the picture, and the picture needed him exactly where he was. I went to the window. The moon was nearly down. The clearing was still, and silver and empty, and the forest stood at its edge dark and patient, and keeping its own counsel as it always had, and always would long after every person connected to this night was in the ground. Somewhere on the path through the trees, a large man was moving toward the cottage with an axe in his hand, breathing hard, having heard something that had made him run. I smoothed the red cape over my shoulders. I opened my mouth and I screamed. The scream I had prepared also. Not in the way you prepare a speech, not with words arranged in advance, but in the way you prepare any tool, by understanding precisely what it needs to do and ensuring it is capable of doing it. A scream is a simple thing at its root, but a useful scream is not simple at all. A useful scream has to carry specific information in it, not words, but something underneath words, the thing that makes people drop what they are holding and run toward a sound they would otherwise run away from. It has to sound like the end of something, like a world coming apart at a seam that was never meant to hold this much. I had a great deal to draw on. I screamed, and the sound of it went out across the clearing, and into the trees, and up into the cold April night, and I screamed again, and then I let it dissolve into weeping. The particular weeping of a girl who has seen something that has broken some essential mechanism inside her, high and ragged and entirely without dignity. And I kept it going with the same attention I had given to everything else this night, monitoring it, adjusting it, ensuring it remained exactly what it needed to be and did not tip over into anything that might seem, to a careful listener, like performance. There are no careful listeners when a girl is screaming in the dark. This I have always known. When the sound is right, people stop being careful and start being animals, responding to the signal before the thinking part of them has had time to weigh in on the matter. The thinking part catches up later, after they have already arrived and already seen what there is to see, and already begun assembling the story that the scene in front of them is telling them to assemble. By then, it is too late for careful listening to do anyone any good. Brennan, the lumberjack, came through the trees at a run. I heard him before I saw him, the crash and snap of a large man moving fast through undergrowth without caring what he broke on the way through. And then he was in the clearing, enormous in the moonlight, his axe still in his right hand where he had been carrying it when he heard the screaming and had simply run without thinking to put it down, which is what I had counted on, what I had built the timing around. The simple, reliable fact that a man working late in the forest with an axe in his hand who hears a girl screaming will run toward the screaming, and he will run with the axe because the axe is in his hand, and he is not thinking about the axe, he is thinking about the screaming. He hit the cottage door with his shoulder, and it flew open, and he came inside and stopped. The firelight showed him everything I had arranged for him to see. The overturned the righted table, the basket, the hearthrug with its disorder that spoke of struggle. The closed door of the back room behind which grandmother lay in her bed, as peaceful and deliberate as I had made her. And in the center of the room, on the floor, Otto, large and dark-haired and dead and entirely human, lying exactly where he had fallen and where I had left him because he was the center of the picture, and the picture needed him exactly there. And me. In the chair, or rather not in the chair, on the floor beside the chair where I had placed myself when I heard Brennan in the trees, on my knees with my hands over my face, and the red cape around my shoulders, and the weeping coming out of me in the high, ragged waves I had calibrated so carefully. The weeping of a girl who has survived something by the narrowest of margins, and is not yet certain she is grateful for the survival. Brennan stood in the doorway with his axe in his hand and looked at all of this. He was not a stupid man. I want to be precise about this because it matters to the telling. He was loud, and he was large, and he had once asked me to dance in a way that had irritated me sufficiently to put him on a list he did not know existed. But he was not stupid, and in the first moment of his standing in that doorway, I saw his eyes move through the room the way a not stupid man's eyes move through a room that contains a dead body and a weeping girl, quickly and with genuine attempt at comprehension, taking inventory, trying to understand what he had walked into. What he walked into was what I had built for him to walk into. A story so clear and so complete that the not-stupid eyes could find no purchase on any alternative version of it. A dead man on the floor who was recognizably, to anyone who had lived in that valley long enough, the man who had married the girl's sister 3 years ago and then killed her and fled into the forest and become the thing the village said prayers against on certain nights. An old woman dead in the back room, which he did not yet know but would, in her bed, which would tell its own story when the time came. And the girl in the red cape, the twice-bereaved girl, the brave, quiet girl who walked the forest road alone, on the floor with her hands over her face and 3 years of genuine grief available to her to draw on, which she was drawing on now, fully and without reservation. And the axe in his hand. He looked down at it. I watched him through my fingers, carefully, the way I watch everything, and I saw the moment he became aware of the axe, saw it register in his face, saw him begin to understand for the first time the picture he himself was making in this room, the large man standing over a dead body with an axe in his hand, and I saw the understanding trouble him in the way that understanding sometimes troubles people when it arrives too late to be useful. He set the axe down. He leaned it against the wall beside the door with a care that was almost comical given the circumstances. The elaborate carefulness of a man who has suddenly become very conscious of how he appears and is trying to correct it. And then he came across the room to me and crouched down and put his large hand on my shoulder and said something, some words. I did not attend to the specific words because the specific words did not matter. What mattered was that he was touching me, and therefore I could touch him. Which is what I needed, and I turned toward him the way a drowning person turns toward anything solid, and I put my hands on his arms, and I held on, and I wept into his chest. And over his shoulder my eyes were open and entirely dry and entirely focused on the work. His hands were on my back. That was not sufficient. I needed his hands on the body, on Otto, his prints on Otto's skin where the marks of what I had done to Otto were, where the story of what had been done to Otto was written in a language that a doctor would be able to read in the morning. And I needed Brennan's prints layered over that story, not obscuring it entirely, not enough to raise questions, but enough to place him in unambiguous physical contact with the dead man in a way he would not be able to account for. I pulled back from him, just slightly, just enough to turn, still holding his arm with both my hands, and I looked at Otto on the floor and I let what was in my face be whatever it needed to be, which required very little effort because Otto's face in the firelight was still Otto's face, and what it did to something in me was not nothing, and has never been nothing, and I use that, the way I use everything that is available to me. I said, "Is he dead?" Not a useful question. The answer was obvious. But it gave Brennan something to do, gave him the role of the competent man assessing the situation, which is a role that large, loud men move into as naturally as water moves into a low place. And he moved into it now, crossing to the body and crouching over it and pressing his fingers to Otto's throat to find the pulse that was not there, and then checking again, because he was a thorough man, and he wanted to be sure before he said what he was going to say. His hands were on Otto now. Both of them, pressing against the throat and then the chest, the way you check a man you are not certain is dead, thoroughly and with genuine intention, leaving the kind of prints that genuine intention leaves, deep and clear and unambiguous. He looked up at me and he said, "Yes." I nodded. I pulled the red cape tighter around my shoulders, and I looked at the wall, and I let the silence sit for a moment. The silence of a girl receiving confirmation of something she already knew, but had been hoping was not true. And then I began to shake, a fine trembling that started in my hands and moved through me in a way that required no effort at all to produce, because my body understood what the moment needed and produced it without being asked. And Brennan saw the shaking and stood up and came back to me and put his arm around my shoulders, and that is when the men from the village arrived. They came in a group of 4, having heard the screaming from the road, farmers and a miller's hand, and the blacksmith's eldest son, who had been the one to come for me 3 years ago on the morning of Marta's death, and who looked, coming through the door of that cottage with a lantern in his hand, and taking in what the lantern showed him, as though the world had decided to repeat itself in the most terrible way possible. They stopped in the doorway. The lantern light moved over the room, over the dead man on the floor and the girl in the red cape, and the large man standing beside her with his arm around her shoulders, and his axe leaning against the wall beside the door. No one spoke for a moment. I looked up at them from inside Brennan's arm with my face doing everything it needed to do, and I said, very quietly, in the voice of a girl who has used up everything she had and is running now on something finer and more fragile than strength. He came through the door. He came through the door, and Grandmother. Grandmother is in the back room. The blacksmith's son went to the back room. The sound he made when he opened the door and held the lantern in was a small sound, involuntary. The sound a person makes when they have been told something terrible and have believed it and then seen it and found that believing it was not the same as seeing it. The other men looked at Brennan. Brennan looked at the men. His axe leaned against the wall in his hands, which had touched Otto's throat and Otto's chest, and which had held me by the shoulders, were at his sides now, open and empty, and he was beginning, I could see it in his face, to understand the shape of the situation he was standing in the middle of, to feel it close around him the way a trap closes, and the understanding was dawning in him slowly, and with great difficulty because it was the kind of understanding that a man like Brennan, a man who has never had particular reason to think carefully about how things look as opposed to how they are, is poorly equipped to arrive at quickly. I looked at him. I let my face show him nothing but the gratitude of a girl he had saved, the trembling, exhausted gratitude of the survivor for the one who came running, and he looked back at me with the beginning of panic in his eyes, and I held his gaze steadily and gave him nothing that could help him. The men from the village looked at the axe against the wall. They looked at Brennan's hands. They looked at Otto on the floor. Outside, the moon was going down, and the forest was dark and quiet and entirely indifferent, and the night was nearly over, and everything was exactly as I had arranged it to be, complete and correct, and without a single loose thread that anyone standing in that room with a lantern was going to find. Not tonight, and not in the days that followed, not ever. I began to weep again, softly this time, with great exhaustion, the weeping of a girl at the end of something long and terrible. It was not entirely a performance. They took me to the village that night and put me in the blacksmith's wife's house. This was the correct place to put me, and they knew it without being told, the way people know such things, through a collective instinct about what a situation requires and who is best placed to provide it. The blacksmith's wife was a warm woman, capable and unsentimental in the way of women who have managed difficult things before and expect to manage them again, and she applied herself to me with the same practical thoroughness she brought to everything, the tea and the blanket and the low, careful voice and the hand on my arm, and I received all of it with the gratitude it was offered with, and I drank the tea, and I let her sit with me until the shaking stopped. The shaking was not entirely a performance. I want to be precise about this. The body, after such a night, has its own accounting to make, separate from the mind's accounting, and it makes it in its own way and on its own schedule, and there is not much to be done about that except let it finish. I let it finish. Then I slept, or appeared to sleep, which is a thing I have always been able to do when it is required of me, the breathing slowing and the eyes closing, and the face arranging itself into the stillness of genuine unconsciousness, while underneath all of it the mind continued its work, quiet and uninterrupted, reviewing what had been done and what remained to be done, and whether anything required adjustment in the light of how the night had gone. Nothing required adjustment. The night had gone as the night was meant to go. The magistrate came in the morning. The same deliberate man who had handled Otto's case 3 years prior, older now, aged by the Otto case in the way that unresolved things age people, carrying it still in the set of his shoulders, and the careful way his eyes moved over a room before settling. He sat across from me in the blacksmith's wife's front room with his hands folded on the table, and he asked his questions without haste, and I answered them with the same patience and the same care, and between us we had, by the end of the morning, constructed a complete and unassailable account of the previous night. I did not accuse Brennan. This is the thing people do not understand about testimony, the thing that makes the difference between testimony that holds and testimony that does not. Accusation draws attention to itself. Accusation invites the question of motive, invites a skepticism that is healthy and dangerous in equal measure. What I offered instead was simply an account. What I had seen, what I had heard, what I had found when I came back to the cottage after dark and let myself in and sat down by the fire. A man on the floor, I said. Already dead when I found him, or very nearly, the last of it happening as I came through the door, the change taking him as death took him, the thing the valley's stories promised, and that I had never thought to see with my own eyes and hoped never to see again. The smell in the room. The state of it. Grandmother's door closed, which was wrong. Grandmother never closed her door from the inside. And then the screaming, my own screaming, which I remembered beginning and did not remember stopping. And then Brennan coming through the door with his axe, and the way he had looked at the body, and the way he had looked at me, and the way he had looked at the axe when he set it down, that careful, elaborate setting down of it, the gesture of a man becoming aware of what he was holding. I described this last detail quietly and without emphasis, looking at my hands as I said it. I want to be fair to him, I said then. He was kind to me. He held me while I wept. Whatever else is true, I want to be fair to him, and I want you to know that. The magistrate wrote something in his book. Brennan's account I was not present for, but I heard it from the blacksmith's wife, who heard it from her husband, who was in the room when it was given, and the shape of it was what I had expected, which is to say it was the shape of the truth, and it was therefore the shape of something no one was going to believe. Not because the people of that village were fools. Because the truth, in this instance, required them to believe a great many difficult things simultaneously, and people can generally manage one difficult thing at a time, but rarely several. The story Brennan was telling required them to believe that the girl in the red cape, the twice-bereaved girl, the quiet, brave girl who had been walking the forest road alone for 3 years and bringing her grandmother bread and salt butter and preserved plums, had in fact killed the grandmother herself and then killed the wolf, the creature they had been afraid of and praying against and telling their children to stay away from. Had killed it through means he could not explain and then arranged the scene to place him in it, and had done all of this with sufficient skill and foresight that there was not a single element of the scene in that cottage that contradicted her account. He had walked into it without seeing it coming because he had heard a girl screaming, and he had run toward the screaming like a decent man, and that was all he had done, and he did not understand how he had come to be standing where he was standing. This was the truth. Every word of it. No one believed him. This was not entirely because of anything I had done, though what I had done was thorough, and held up under the examination it received in those days without a seam showing. It was also because of what was on the floor of grandmother's cottage, the fact at the center of everything, the fact around which all other facts arranged themselves and took their meaning from. The dead man was Otto, the man who had killed Marta, the creature that had been living in the forest for 3 years, eating the valley's livestock and frightening its children and haunting its nights, which had turned out, dead on the floor of an old woman's cottage in the thin light of a spring morning, to be nothing more and nothing less than a man, large and dark-haired and still, entirely human in death as he had not always been in life. With a dead old woman in the back room and a girl in a red cape who had survived the night, and a lumberjack with an axe who had not been able to account for himself to anyone's satisfaction. The axe was examined. The doctor examined Otto with the thoroughness the magistrate's deliberateness demanded, and he found what he found, which was consistent with what an axe in the hands of a strong man might do, which Brennan was, which no one who looked at Brennan would have any difficulty believing, and the prints on Otto's throat and chest were large prints, consistent with large hands, which Brennan had. And none of what the doctor found was inconsistent with the account that the village was already assembling around the evidence it had been given. The account that made sense of everything in the simplest and most available way, which is always the account that prevails. Brennan continued to protest. He protested with the energy of a man who believes that sufficient protestation will eventually produce belief, which is a thing that innocent people believe and guilty people know better than to rely on. He was confused and he was frightened, and the confusion and the fright were genuine and visible, and I think on some level the magistrate saw that they were genuine and was troubled by it, because the magistrate was a careful man, and careful men notice things that less careful men do not. But noticing a thing and being able to act on it are different matters entirely. And what the magistrate could act on was the evidence in front of him and the testimony of the girl in the red cape, who had looked at him with her honest, exhausted, grief-worn face, and told him she wanted to be fair to Brennan. She wanted him to know that, whatever else was true. That whatever else was true had done its work. I had known it would. On the 3rd day after the night in the cottage, they came and took Brennan. I was in the village square when they brought him out, standing with the blacksmith's wife who had appointed herself my guardian in the aftermath of everything. A kind woman, genuinely kind, who held my arm with the protective firmness of a person who believes they are standing between a fragile thing and a world that has already been too hard on it. The square was not empty. Word had gone around, as word does in small places, and people had found reasons to be in the vicinity of the square on that particular morning. Not crowding exactly, not the spectacle of a public event, but present, watching from doorways and from the corner of the market, and from the bench outside the inn where two old men sat every morning regardless of the weather and were sitting now. Brennan came out between two men, not bound. The magistrate had not ordered him bound, which was a mercy of a kind, a concession to the uncertainty that the magistrate could not act on, but also could not entirely suppress. He was very large in the morning light and very pale, and he walked with the particular walk of a man who has spent 3 days arguing against a wall, and has not yet accepted that the wall is not going to move, but is beginning to suspect it. He saw me across the square. I held his gaze. I let my face show him the grief that was there for him to see, the genuine, complicated grief of a girl who has done what needed doing and does not regret it, and yet finds in the looking at this particular face something that is not regret but is adjacent to it, something that acknowledges the cost of necessary things without being weakened by that acknowledgement. And I held that in my face, and I did not look away, and I did not help him, and I did not hinder him. And after a moment he looked away first, and they walked him across the square and out the far side of it and down the road, and I watched him go until he was gone. The blacksmith's wife pressed my arm and said something quiet and sympathetic about the terrible things the world contains, and I agreed with her, and we stood there together in the spring morning light until there was nothing left to look at, and then we went inside. The cottage is mine now. No one disputed this. There was no one left to dispute it, grandmother having outlived everyone who might have had a prior claim, and the village having decided the matter in the way villages decide such things, through a collective unspoken agreement that hardens into fact before anyone has quite noticed it happening. The magistrate filed the necessary papers. The blacksmith's wife came and helped me air the rooms and beat the rugs and scrub the floors, which is how women in that valley mark a transition, through hot water and hard work, as though cleanliness is a form of beginning again. Perhaps it is. I have always found clean floors satisfying. It is summer now. 2 months since the night in the cottage, and the valley has moved on in the way valleys do, without consulting anyone, without pausing to take note of what has happened inside it. The trees are in their full dark canopy. The birds are loud in the mornings. The garden along the south wall is keeping itself the way a well-tended garden does, as though the years of grandmother's attention have become part of the soil itself and do not require her presence to continue. The sweet peas she planted along the fence have come up without being asked, pink and white and soft, and I look at them sometimes in the early light, and I think about Marta, who believed that beauty was as necessary as anything else and should be planned for accordingly. I find I cannot argue with this. Not anymore. The village still waves when I pass. This has not changed, and I did not expect it to change, and it will not change, because there is nothing in what the village knows or believes that would cause it to change. The girl in the red cape on the forest road. The twice-bereaved girl. The brave, quiet girl who survived the night that the creature came through the unlatched door, and who has buried her parents and her sister and her grandmother, and who walks the road anyway, steadily and without complaint, because what else is there to do? They wave and I wave back, and they return to their lives satisfied. This is how it has always been. This is how it will continue to be. Brennan is in the jail in the city to the north. The proceedings will determine what remains of his life and the shape it will take, which will not be the shape it would have had if he had not come running through the trees that night with his axe in his hand. He was the kind of man who runs toward the screaming, who acts before he thinks, who crashes through undergrowth in the dark toward whatever needs, saving without stopping to consider what he might be running into. The village admired this quality in him. He probably admired it in himself. It was also the quality that put him exactly where I needed him. I find a deep satisfaction in this. Not cruelty, I want to be precise about that. I do not take pleasure in Brennan's suffering as a thing in itself. What I take pleasure in is the fitness of it, the way everything held together, the way each element I had placed did exactly what I had placed it to do. The chain and the thread and the supper at the inn and the basket on the table and the door left unlatched. All of it clean and exact, and without a single loose thread for anyone to pull on. This is what satisfaction is, for me. Not the result, but the making. The quality of the work. I think about this on the forest path in the mornings, when the light comes through the canopy at the angle that makes the whole wood glow, green and gold and shifting, the most beautiful it gets. I think about the plan and the execution of the plan, and the way the magistrate's pen moved in his book when I told him I wanted to be fair to Brennan. I wanted him to know that, whatever else was true. I think about Otto's face in the firelight after the change, the face of the man my sister loved lying still on the floor of the cottage, and I think about what I felt standing over him, the thing I opened and looked at and then put away, and I find that I can think about it now without the opening, can examine it from the outside, cleanly, the way you examine a thing through glass. This is progress of a kind. I note it and move on. The cape is on my shoulders as I walk, as it is always on my shoulders, warm and red, and the only thing of Marta's that remains in the physical world, the only piece of her that I can put my hands on. I am aware of it always, the weight of it, the particular way the clasp sits at my throat, the way it moves when I walk. It was hers, and it will always be hers regardless of who is wearing it, and I do not pretend otherwise, not to myself, not in the room where I keep her, which is the largest room in me and the only one with any light in it. I think about her on the path. Not the end of her. The middle of her. The garden and the laugh and the morning she put the cape on my shoulders in the road without hesitation, as though she had always intended to give it to me and had simply been waiting for the right moment to arrive. I think about the way she said you can and you will, and the way that was the end of the discussion, because when Marta decided something, the deciding of it was so complete, and so without doubt that arguing felt not wrong, but simply beside the point, like arguing with the direction of a river. I carry her the way the river carries the rain that made it, without thinking about it, without being able to stop. She is the only honest thing in me, and I know it and I have always known it, and I do not require it to be otherwise. What I am is what I am, and what I am has served me well, and will go on serving me, and the world will go on mistaking the red cape for the girl wearing it, which is all I have ever asked of the world, and more than enough. The forest is quiet this morning. The path is dry and firm under my feet, root and stone, the familiar sequence of it, 1.5 miles that I know the way I know my own hands. The village is ahead of me, and the people in it are going about their lives, and when they see me coming they will wave, and I will wave back, and everything will be exactly as it appears to be, which is to say exactly as I have made it appear, which is to say nothing like what it is. There is a woman in the village. The miller's wife. She has been unwell this winter, a persistent cough, a weakness in her chest that the doctor watches with the same professional concern he brought to grandmother's heart. And her husband is a man I have observed over the past several months with the particular quality of attention I bring to things that interest me. A quiet man, a careful man, a man who has more sense than to ask a girl to dance badly and then laugh about it. He has been kind to me in the aftermath of everything. Thoughtful. He brought wood to the cottage in May without being asked and stacked it neatly against the south wall and refused any payment and said only that it was the least a neighbor could do. I thanked him. I meant it, which is rare enough to be worth noting. The miller's wife has been unwell for some months now. These things happen. The doctor says so, and he is right. These things do happen. Illness is a fact of life in a valley where the winters are long, and the damp gets into everything, and people do not always take the care of themselves that they ought to. I smooth the red cape over my shoulders, and I walk on toward the village in the summer morning light, and the forest stands on either side of me, patient and dark and entirely indifferent, keeping its counsel the way it always has. The miller's wife has been unwell, and I have been thinking about the wood stacked neatly against the south wall, and the man who stacked it, and the particular quality of his attention when he looks at me, which is careful and considered, and without any of the clumsy obviousness that made Brennan's name go onto a list he did not know existed. I think about these things and I walk, and the red cape moves around my shoulders in the warm summer air, and ahead of me, the village is waking, and the day is beginning, and everything is exactly as it appears to be. It always is. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing so you never miss a story. And if you want to support the show, leaving a review on your favorite podcast app really helps us grow. Hope to see you next time.